In the first video, we outlined the nature of the just war theory. In the second, we considered a potential reason for why some peoples have sought to restrain the outbreak and the violence of conflict, namely that there is a recognition that the enemy is sufficiently similar to be deemed persons, which is a moral term to say they have a similar moral status, rather than some description which implies that the enemy is not worthy of that personhood. In this tutorial, we're going to review the key ideas that have come down to us through the ages. Indeed, the just war tradition appears to be as old as warfare itself. Early records of collective fighting indicate that some moral considerations were used by warriors to limit the outbreak of war or to rein in the potential devastation of their warfare. These may have involved, for instance, consideration towards women and children, or the treatment of prisoners, such as enslaving them rather than killing them, or ransoming them for money, or exchanging them for their own prisoners. Commonly, the earlier traditions invoked considerations of honour. Some acts in war have always been deemed dishonourable, while others have been deemed honourable to be upheld on the battlefield. However, what is honourable is often highly specific to culture. For instance, a suicidal attack may be deemed the honourable act for one people, but ludicrous or a violation of sacred duties to God to another culture. Paul Robinson, in 2006, noted that honour conventions are contextually slippery, giving way to pragmatic or military interest when required. Now, whereas the specifics of what is honourable differ with time and place, the very fact that, let's say, a single moral virtue is alluded to in the great literature, for example, Homer's Iliad, is sufficient for us to note that warfare has been infused with some moral concerns from its very beginning, rather than being a mere Macbethian bloodbath with no moral compass whatsoever. Traditions of acceptable conduct in war can be derived from early literature, but also the images of enslavement found in ancient images and depictions of war as opposed to genocidal massacres, which may have happened, but perhaps were not commemorated because such episodes were considered shameful in some manner or form. The just war theory, the explicit codification of war and warfare, has a long history. Parts of the Bible hint at ethical behaviour in war and concepts of a just cause, typically announcing the justice of war by divine intervention. The Greeks may have paid lip service to the gods, but as with the Romans, practical and political issues tended to overwhelm any fledgling legal conventions, that is, interests of state or realpolitik, the theory known as political realism, which would take precedence in declaring and waging war. This has also been the reading of political realists who enjoy Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War as an example of why war is necessarily the extension of politics and hence permeated by hard-nosed state interests rather than lofty pretensions to moral behaviour. Nonetheless, one of the most memorable actions that is commemorated in Homer's Iliad, which recounts the famous story of the siege of Troy, or Ilium in Latin, is the action of Achilles after killing Hector. Instead of permitting what was deemed the necessary and honourable collection of Hector's body off the battlefield by the Trojans, Achilles ties the corpse to his chariot and drags it around the walled city several times, thus meeting a terrible dishonour upon the character of Hector and thereby on his family too. The violation does not go unpunished. The god Apollo disguises himself as Paris and kills Achilles as a reminder to the listener and the reader later on that there are some codes that they should not violate. The Romans had law and legal experts, and indeed it is from their philosophy and works that much modern international law stems. The Romans evoked a difference between the jus gentium and the jus naturale, the laws that people make and the laws that are universal or natural. As the Roman Empire spread, the legal theorists noted similarities in seemingly disparate people's laws, from which the notion of the law of all peoples was born, that is, an international law to which Romans and barbarians were subject. Indeed, the Roman notion of justia means a sense of natural order, or natural law as we call it today, which encompasses everybody. The pragmatic Roman scholar and legal rhetorician and orator Cicero, for instance, was well adept at deploying appeals to the natural order of things to highlight and condemn military and political corruption within Rome. From the Roman legal system emerged a very legalistic philosophy and morality of war then, and with it elements of what we call the justum bellum, or the laws of justifying a war. The right of the state to protect itself from rebellion, for example, as well as consideration regarding the treatment of Roman and non-Romans. Much of Cicero's thought is derived from Greek, and particularly Aristotelian influences, Aristotle, the great philosopher. For instance, the idea that it is reason that unites all people, and that the social life, or the city life, is vital for human happiness. And also from Plato that the state must act to secure their safety, and hence happiness, and for the leaders to be learned and wise, not seeking their own glory, but that of their nation, or city-state as it was in the Greek period. Cicero was one Roman amongst many great thinkers, of course, but it is often from him that the Roman legalistic legacy is continued, and indirectly we hear the ideas of the Greeks too. In Western Europe, the ideals of Rome and remnants of Greek philosophy were subsumed in the rising of Christian theology, with the later rise of Islam, and the great Greek philosophers were prominent in the works of their great thinkers. Jumping over to around about 400 AD, St. Augustine, who at the end of the Roman Empire, which was literally collapsing around him in the 400s, provided commentaries on the morality of war from the Christian perspective, railing against the love of violence that war can engender, as did several Arabic commentators in the great Arab intellectual flourishing from the 9th to the 12th centuries. The most systematic exposition in the Western tradition, as it's been known for a long time, for several hundred years, although I would argue it's universal, and one that still attracts our attention, and rightly so, from philosophers, was outlined by St. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century. In the Summa Theologicae, Aquinas, as he is known, or St. Thomas, presents the general outline of what becomes the traditional just war theory that students look at today. Aquinas discusses not only the justification of war, but also the kinds of activity that are permissible, albeit for a Christian, in war. Whilst St. Augustine had made no distinction between the jus ad bellum, the rules of the justification of going to war, and the jus in bello, the justification of acts within war, Thomas or Aquinas separates the two, and in doing so forms the logical basis for the development of the modern theory of the justum bellum, the just war theory, along with an extension of the jus in bello, the considerations of the principles of proportionality, of discrimination, and the use of double effect within warfare. We come back to those in a later tutorial. Interestingly, and in contrast to later conventions that we're familiar with, that obeying orders is not an excuse, for Aquinas, he argues that if a private citizen has legitimate authority given by his state to draw his sword, or if a public official uses it out of a sense of justice or of God's will, then he is above punishment. Aquinas writes that, quote, he himself does not draw the sword, but is commissioned by another to use it, and does not deserve punishment. But he does temper this potential for a no-holds-barred thinking in which the soldier can enact any kind of violence on the battlefield. That those who take up arms unjustly, although secular justice may not exact revenge on them, quote, even those who do use it sinfully are not always slain with the sword, they will be punished after death unless they repent. The citizen, Aquinas notes, must bear in mind the possibility of sinning in warfare, and thus must be prepared also not to fight if justice is so deemed. This is an interesting angle which is picked up in many a modern war. Aquinas' thoughts became the model for later philosophers called the Scholastics and their intellectual descendants, who revised the Roman ideal of the rule of law, or natural law, that passed quickly through Augustine and more thoughtfully through Aquinas and other pre-Renaissance and Renaissance thinkers to a group known as the jurists, to expand the war conventions. As Western exploration, trade and influence expanded, these ideals were seen to be universalizable beyond the European Christian realm, notably, for instance, in relations with the peoples of America following European invasions into that continent. How should the natives of these hitherto undiscovered lands, albeit by the Europeans describing them, of course, be treated? How should they be treated was a prominent question in theological minds. The most important of these writers in the jurist phase were Francisco de Vitoria, Francisco Suarez, Hugo Grotius, Samuel Pufendorf, Christian Wolff, and Emmerich de Vattel. The jurist writings have had an influence on international codes of conduct in war and peacetime, seeking as they did to extend human rationality, our reason, from the national to the international sphere. Indeed, the later and more familiar to us Geneva and Hague Conventions, the human rights codes, and the ratifications of articles on the freedom of the seas, and that one goes back to the 1500s, that no nation shall claim possession of the oceans or impede navigation, have their roots in this period. Such attempts, and the relatively recent inheritance of what we call international law, are a product of deep intellectual roots promoted by such philosophers, jurists, theologians and political thinkers, stretching back through time to the ancient Greeks, the Romans, the early Christian, the Judaic, the Islamic thinkers. These thinkers, idealists to some, have sought to stretch useful local restraints on tribal or national policies outward to encompass humanity as a whole. The friction between local or state interests, or the national interests as it's often referred to, has not disappeared, and it is a theme that we shall return to again and again in these tutorials. In the 20th century, just war theory underwent a revival, mainly in response to the invention of nuclear weaponry and American involvement in the Vietnam War, and later the US and Western nations' reactions to 9/11 and wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. The most important contemporary texts that I can refer you to include Michael Waltz's Just and Unjust Wars, Paskins and Dockrell, The Ethics of War, 1979, Richard Norman, Ethics, Killing and War, Brian Arend, War and International Justice, Michael Waltz's War and Justice, as well as seminal articles by Thomas Nagel, War and Massacre, and Elizabeth Anscombe, War and Murder, and a host of others, commonly found in the journals of ethics or the Journal of Philosophy and Public Affairs, etc. Just war theory has in recent decades thus become a popular topic in international relations, political science, philosophy, ethics, and military history courses. What has been of great interest is that in the headline wars of the past decades, the dynamic interplay of the rules and conventions of warfare not only remain intact on the battlefield, but their role and hence their explication have been awarded a higher level of scrutiny and debate. In political circles, justification of war still requires, even in the most critical analysis, a superficial acknowledgement of fairness and justification. On the ground, generals have extolled their troops to adhere to the rules. Soldiers are taught the just war conventions in military academies, for example, explicitly through military ethics courses or implicitly through veterans' experiences or mottos or notions of honour within a regiment. Yet despite the emphasis on abiding by war's conventions, war crimes continue. Genocidal campaigns have been waged by mutually hating peoples. Leaders have waged total war on ethnic groups within or outside their borders, and individual soldiers or guerrilla bands have committed atrocious murders or humiliating acts on their enemy. But arguably, such acts do remain atrocities and labelled as such by virtue of the just war conventions that some things in war are deemed to be inexcusable, regardless of the righteousness of the cause or the noise and the fog of battle. The use of violence can bring out the worst in humans, but it also attracts those who are naturally murderous, sadistic, or plainly evil, of course. Yet increasingly the rule of law, the need to hold violators and transgressors responsible for their actions in war and therefore after battles, just as domestic criminals are held responsible in the courts of our nations, is making headway into warfare, most notably in the 20th century following the end of the Second World War and the Nuremberg and Tokyo trials and the formation of the International Court of Justice, which prosecutes war criminals. In the next tutorial, we're going to move on to the modern principles of just war as we have inherited them and summarised them. And I look forward to any comments that you may have in the commentary boxes below. Thank you very much.